Good evening, and a very warm welcome once again.
Thank you very much.
To Mr. Mohan Kumar Mangalam and Dr. Shashi tharoor. Yes, it is indeed a great privilege to have you with us, but pleasure, I'm not so sure because I'm nervous. Thank God for small mercy. I was just wondering what if there is a role reversal and Dr. Tharoor was to sit and ask me questions. Forget about the answers, I won't even understand his questions. Okay, but having said that, since I understand we're running a bit out of time, one of the issues you've been recently speaking about, apart from your pet sport, if you may call it so, bash the British, I'll come to it a little later, is the demographic dividend of India and its corollaries, which you can see over there. But before you start, Dr. Tharoor, I'd like to remind you that this audience, if you notice, is full of people who already contribute heavily to the dependency ratio or will shortly do so. So in your talk, we'll be grateful if you could also include a few tips on how we, the numerator and the ratio, can stay relevant.
Well, if the idea is for us to have a dialogue, let me just offer a couple of thoughts and we can continue the exchange. The demographic dividend theory is actually not a bad theory because the numbers warrant it. If you look at the fact that 2/3 of our population, at least 65–66%, are under 35, that's a remarkable figure.
Sure.
If you look at the fact that there are, between the ages of 10 and 19, something like 287 million Indians right now. And these are the ones who are going to grow up and become the workforce over the next 10 years. If you look at the fact that the ILO, the International Labour Organization, has said that India's workforce by 2020 should be 116 million people, whereas China's will have gone down to 93 million. So China is aging and we are not. If you look at the fact that the average age as of 2020 will be 46 in Europe, will be 47 in Japan, will be 40 in the US, and only 29 in India. So you look at all of this, the logical inference is that India should be the country that provides the youthful, energetic, dynamic, working force for the world of the 21st century, at least for the first half of the 21st century. We could be the engine of the world and play for the next generation the role that China has played for the last 2 generations. But, and there's a big but there, how do we actually translate the theory of this demographic dividend into a real achievable outcome? We need obviously to equip these young people with the skills, the training, the education to be able to take advantage of the magnificent opportunity that awaits them if they're able to take advantage of it. This has been our most spectacular failure. I'm not saying something I haven't said before. I have made this diagnosis all of 5–6 years ago when I was in the Ministry of Human Resource Development. At that point, all I could do was make speeches about it and write about it because, as I have subsequently joked, when you're a Minister of State in the government of India, it's like standing in a cemetery. There are lots of people under you, but nobody is listening. So I thought, let me at least get these ideas and thoughts out into the public space. But having done that, I was gratified initially when the BJP government said they were going to make a big issue of this, they were going to create a skill development ministry. Sadly, their results have been, to put it mildly, underwhelming. We are failing the skill development challenge. Meanwhile, kids are continuing to drop out of school, barely literate, without any useful skills, and they are going to be entering the workforce. We don't seem to have an economic policy to absorb these people, let alone to train them to take up these opportunities. The Prime Minister is saying Make in India, but we've seen absolutely no spurt in Make in India in the last 3.5 years. In fact, Mohan and I just released a report showing that in many ways what we're seeing is unmake in India, because Tirupur, which the All India Professionals Congress of Tamil Nadu has studied in detail, has actually found a genuine decline in its output since the BJP has come to power, and what is more, it has also witnessed a hemorrhaging of jobs every week coming out of the textile industry. So we are facing a genuine challenge, and the demographic dividend therefore risks becoming a demographic nightmare. Now, I'm not a pessimist by nature. If anything, I tend to see the positives in everything. So my own instinct is to say, how can we fix this? But very clearly, we need to do two things urgently. One is we need to massively upscale the business of skilling, and given the proven limitations of the government in this area, I would seriously enlist the private sector. I would, if necessary, after all, we're an over-regulated economy anyway. Let's add one more regulation, which would not be a back-breaking one, but oblige companies of a certain worth to set up skill development capacity. In the end, it'll help them too, because they'll skill people in what they are able to teach them, and as a result, they'll be able to hire them too when the time comes, at least hire some of them. But I think we'll have to get the private sector into skill development very seriously. And on top of that, it seems to me that we will also have to reorient the government's economic policies into areas where we can absorb skilled and semi-skilled and unskilled labor in larger numbers. Now, Mr. Modi thought he could do that by manufacturing, but he is saying make in India at a time when many countries will make the same items anywhere, but not using human beings anymore, using machines, automation, robotics. So we need to find things that robots can't do, that machines can't do. And one obvious strength we would have if we had only invested in it bigger is in the tourism sector. We have magnificent monuments, ruins, natural sites, which are in woeful condition, surrounded by decaying or non-existent infrastructure. We don't have adequate hotels for all range of travelers throughout the country. If we can seriously sink money into tourism, develop tourist sites and the infrastructure around them, encourage hotels to come up that will employ people. The fact is that we can attract tourists, but they don't come right now, A, because there's very little that they're able to easily go and see in comfortable conditions. There's dirt, there's grunge, there's hawkers importuning them, all of these problems. And one of the reasons that we're not able to employ a lot of people who might otherwise be employable is because we haven't given enough incentives to create 1-star, 2-star, 3-star hotels near these tourist sites. Because after all, a hotel will hire people who don't have any skills. It doesn't take much training to produce a good waiter, a good busboy, a good Mali's assistant, a good hotel guard. There are lots of functions in the hospitality industry where you can take unskilled or semi-skilled people and very quickly bring them up to scratch. It's not like IT, it's not like Infosys hiring engineers and having to re-educate them for a year, which is what they're doing in Mysore. This is some much simpler task. But to do this, we need to sink money, we need to prioritize these areas. This is my short-term diagnosis. There's a lot more that needs to be done. And obviously there are areas of success in the Indian economy that we should definitely continue to strengthen, but which are not necessarily related to the demographic dividend. Since the question was about the demographic dividend, I'm only focusing on what will generate jobs for young people. Because the alternative, frankly, is that many of these young men will become a danger to and a menace to our society. There is nothing more dangerous in the world than large legions of unemployed, undereducated, and therefore unemployable young men. These are the ones who are prey to the blandishments of ideologues with 1,000 rupees and a Kalashnikov, who have created the Maoist insurrections, which have in many ways, to a greater or lesser degree, affected 165 of our country's 625 districts. So this is a serious challenge for us. It's not just a demographic challenge, it is also a national security challenge.
Thank you. I recall, Dr. Tharoor, you had mentioned about frugal innovation as one of the roots. Could you just throw some light on that?
Well, if you Google the phrase frugal innovation, you'll find the top 20 essentially relate to innovations that Indian companies have come up with or international companies have come up with in India. The idea of frugal innovation is very simple. It is that we innovate either totally new products or more likely we reimagine and repurpose existing products in such a way that they're very much cheaper than anywhere else in the world. That's why frugal innovation. And this is more than just jugaad, the usual Indian expression which ultimately involves cutting corners. These things have to work properly. But for example, we have created in India the world's cheapest electrocardiogram machine. GE, international company, but they built it here with Indian engineers. What do? They took the ECG, they stripped off most of the buttons and reduced it to just 4 essential buttons. The printer that prints out the electrocardiogram diagram is now about the size of one of these little things the waiters bring you in restaurants for your credit card to print out the bill. That's it. And on top of that, it operates on a battery. So you don't even need to worry about using it in a place where electricity has to be available, which is true of the normal EKG machine. The result is you now have an ECG that costs $1, 60 rupees for an ECG, and you can take it to the villages and use it on poor people. And given that about 5 million Indians die every year of undiagnosed heart conditions, heart attacks essentially, we might be able to treat and save many lives in this way. A second more common example is the Tata Swachh water filter, which just uses the waste matter from paddy fields, rice husks, and uses that to filter water and removes 99% of the impurities. Amazingly cheap. The ECG has reduced the cost, as I said, from $60 to $1. In the case of the water filter, I think it retails for the equivalent of about $24 in India, about 1,500 rupees. But in anywhere else in the world, you can't get a filter that does that much for less than 10 times that price. You can keep on going through examples. You've all heard of the innovative Jeep that Mahindra designed and came up with here, but unfortunately manufactures in China and sells to America. But the idea again is, how do you read? The Tata Nano may be a better example, even if it was a marketing disaster here. They took the basic idea of the car and they stripped it down. So you no longer have side view mirrors, you no longer have expensive hubcaps, you sort of eliminate a large number of things, including you use aluminium for the engine rather than steel to reduce the weight of the car and thereby reduce fuel consumption. You move the wheels to the edge of the chassis so that and they've got 32 international patents for their design. But as a result, they trimmed the cost of the car down to initially, as you remember, just 1 lakh of rupees. I know with taxes and so on, it's double that now, but even at 2 lakhs, it's the cheapest car in the world. Now, because they marketed it badly by saying, buy the cheapest car in the world, and no one wants to be seen driving the cheapest car in the world, it failed. But the innovation part was actually a huge success. The best example of all would be Mangalyaan. You know, we became the first country in the world to successfully launch a Mars orbiter at our first attempt. The US and EU have orbiters, but they took many, many attempts and failures before they succeeded. The Chinese and Japanese have still not succeeded, and we did it on the first attempt, the only country. But what's more striking about that is the total cost of that Mars expedition was $74 million, which is less than the budget of the Hollywood space movie Gravity. And what is more, it's about 11% of what NASA spent on its Mars orbiter budget. So that's the kind of frugal innovation that India is supposed to be good at. And we can keep doing good things cheaply, we can change lives. And I will take it even one step further. You won't necessarily find this in Google, but I heard from Professor Mashelkar, many of you have heard of him, Professor Arya Mashelkar. He instituted an award for innovation in his late mother's name. And he wanted specifically not just frugal innovation, but innovation that particularly helped the poor in our society, that solved Indian problems that affected large numbers of Indians. And he gave the first year's prize, to a young man who said, you know, it's very interesting. We have 15 million people in our country who are blind, most of whom are preventably blind. You know that. Because they are unable to take the test to identify glaucoma or whatever in time. It invades their eyes, they lose their sight, they become blind, they're treated as blind, end of story. Why is it they don't take these tests? Not because the tests are too expensive alone. Test prices can even be reduced. And there are eye camps where you can get the test for free. The problem is that most of the poor in our country are daily wage workers. And these glaucoma tests dilate your eyes leaving you with blurred vision for 4 or 5 hours afterwards. Now you tell me a daily wage worker can afford to have blurred vision for 4, so they don't go and do the test, because if the day they do the test, their family doesn't eat. They're not able to earn the money to buy food for the wife and children. So they don't go. So this young man invented a glaucoma eye test that does not leave the patient with blurred vision. And Dr. Mashelkar was telling me this is the kind of innovation our country needs, and I hope we can have more of these things coming up. Frugal innovation clearly both creates a product that is cheap. You know, we have the world's cheapest hepatitis vaccine. It used to be $15 for hepatitis B vaccine. It's now down to $1 because of Biocon. We have the world's cheapest insulin injections. Slashed the cost of insulin injections by a tenth, again because of India's Biocon innovation. So frugal things will not only make things cheaper for us and for the world, but they will also address the real problems of poor Indians that no one's been addressing. And that's, I think, the great merit of this approach.
Okay. Yeah, that's quite understandable. I think Dr. Geeta should take a cue from what he was talking about in terms of glaucoma, etc. She is, how shall I call it? She is a specialist in ophthalmology, or some advanced science in ophthalmology. So I'm sure she will have taken a cue from this. Yeah, it's on.
In fact, I was just going to mention that I belong to Shankar Nethralaya. I have been working there for the last 15 years. And we in fact have a very significant innovation where a mobile bus goes to the doorstep of the patients, which has been made in coordination with the IIT. And we actually take the surgeries to the doorstep of the people who are in the remote villages. And it is of interest to tell her that in fact Rotary is now associated with Shankar Nethralaya through a global grant for this very noble procedure.
That sounds wonderful. That's exactly the kind of thing we need to see more of happening.
Yeah.
But I'm alarmed to discover she's an ophthalmologist. After all she said about my hair, if she had to look into my eyes, what might I have heard?
Let me get a bit predictable now. The systematic plunder that the British did and the kind of irreparable hurt that it has caused to India. Just to refresh our minds and just to make sure that I got those numbers right, could you just give us a short summary of those mind-boggling numbers you have mentioned?
Well, I mean, the numbers are only part of the story, but I'll mention them. You know, we accounted for 27% of global GDP back in 1700, and as late as 1800, 23% of global GDP. But by the time the British left, they had reduced us to 3% or just over, and into a poster child for poverty, despair, and illiteracy. We had ended up in a situation in which 90% of our population in 1947, 90% lived below what we would call the poverty line. The literacy rate in India had been reduced to barely 17%. In fact, 8.8% of India's women could read and write. In other words, you put 13 women in a room and only one of them would be able to read and write. You're looking at 12 women in a room anyway, and you only find one. You are looking at a country where the rate of growth under British rule from 1900 to 1947 was below 0.01%. So there was a terrible, shall we say, decline in India's economic fortunes under British rule. A significant reason for this was the fact that what Dadabhai Naoroji and other Indian nationalists call the drain theory, that is that they looted resources from India, extracted them from this country, and drained them by sending these resources back to England. As a result, England grew richer. I have got a little account of Horace Walpole, the writer, going down a street and literally describing each mansion that has been built with Indian money. Much of London has been built up with money that has been made off the backs of the Indian peasant, the Indian farmer, and of course the Indian nobleman. One of my critics says, how did it matter to the Indian peasant whether a rich Indian noble had lots of money or whether an Englishman had a lot of money. Maybe not, but at least the Indian nobleman was spending his money in India. One of the ironic footnotes of which is not even something I make a big fuss about in the book, is that because the British were taking all the money out of India, the Indian luxury goods industry collapsed. Because all the exploitative nobles of the Mughal court were at least paying Indian artisans, Indian goldsmiths, Indian jewelers, Indian brocade makers, Indian fancy linens and so on for their comfort. Now the money was going off to London, being spent in the fashion houses of Paris. That was the transformation. So the drainage of Indian resources been amply documented in some detail, and I have given a lot of numbers in the book. I won't regurgitate them now, but if you read An Era of Darkness, the numbers are all there. So the exploitation of India, I felt, was more than just numbers. There was also the destruction of the thriving economy that India was when the British came, the destruction of the shipbuilding industry, the destruction of the textile industry. We've just been talking, as I said, about Tirupur, but there is no question that the textile industry, for example, of Bengal, which used to produce the finest quality muslins, gauzes, linens for export, was wrecked by the British. It smashed their looms, in one notorious incident, cut off the thumbs of the weavers, and essentially brought these industries to a grinding halt. Murshidabad and Dhaka became the first cities in the modern world to actually lose population. All cities seem to keep growing forever. These two lost population with the destruction of these industries, and the British, of course, flooded the Indian market at the point of a gun with their cloth, which then took over the countryside. So all of these, and I give a few more examples in the book, are examples of the kind of economic exploitation that the British conducted during their 200 years here.
Okay. For those of us, or those who have not read the book, or those of you who have not read the book, I recommend that you read it. As a matter of fact, I think politicians can make an election promise out of it, saying, I'll get that money back from Britain. It's huge monies, let me tell you that.
Well, there was an Indian journalist, Minaz Merchant, who calculated what he said the British owed us, and he came up with £3 trillion, which is more than the entire GDP of Britain. They're not going to pay us back, even if some politician promises it.
But Dr. Tharoor, would you say that the British left no worthwhile legacy at all? What about English education? Most of us here in this room do feel that we owe a lot of our success to the familiarity with the English language. And you yourself, with your impeccable English and that huge vocabulary, could easily pass for a sophisticated Anglophile.
Look, I like the English language, and I read a lot in English language by virtue of the fact that I grew up in India studying in English, because that was the colonial legacy, and it was the legacy to which I am heir, and perhaps many in this room,
yes, true.
And certainly on the stage, are also heir. But having said that, they didn't do this to favor us. What was very interesting was that Macaulay, in his notorious Minute on Education 1835, made it very clear that the British had no desire to spend the money to educate the Indian masses. All they wanted to do was to create a very small class, a sort of interpreters between the governors and the governed. A class, as he put it, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste and opinions and morals and in intellect, quote unquote, who would be created to serve the interests of the British rulers in India. For the most part, by the way, these were people created with a level of English inadequate to hold their own against the Brits, but adequate to push the files, do the clerical jobs, write the basic correspondence, and so on, that was required. It was Indian smartness that they actually went beyond what the British had intended. Many of the big institutions of learning in English were established by Indians, not by the Brits, and some by missionaries again, not by British government policy. As late as 1930, Will Durant, the American historian, said that the entire sum the British government was spending on education in India, from kindergarten to university, the entire sum was less than half the high school budget of the state of New York in 1930. So it's difficult to give the British credit for. They ruled us. English was the language, and just as when the Mughals ruled us, Persian was the language to know. So we had to know English. I mean, in fact, the entire caste community Their so-called Sanskritization, to use M.N. Srinivas's famous phrase, is actually Persianization, because what the Kayas did, they were a Shudra subcaste who, by learning Persian and becoming scribes to the court, rose up in importance and became the top administrators, even becoming ambassadors and prime ministers, entirely through their mastery of administrative procedures. It's a very fascinating story. But that happened to be Persian initially, and they made a seamless transition to English. In our case, because 200 years is a pretty long time, it's many, many lifespans, we all learned English, and that was useful language. Now, it also helps that for us today, English has also become the language of globalization, and therefore there are reasons completely independent of colonial rule for us to want to know English. Most of you all are presumably functioning in a system in which you have clients, customers, perhaps employees and so on, who are not able to function in a common language with you other than English. It may be a second language for them as well as for you, but it's a second language of a rather large chunk of the world's population. So there's no point looking at these numbers that say Chinese is the most spoken language in the world, or that Spanish overtakes English and so on. If you just look at the numbers of how many people have enough English as a second or third language to be able to function in it, then English wins the globalization debate, hands down. And that's why Indians have continued using it. And in fact, we have stories, pathetic stories of maids and rickshaw pullers and so on, putting aside their meager savings in order to send their children to a so-called English medium school. Often a really third-rate thing taught by people who can barely speak English themselves, because they see English as a passport to success in today's world. It was no accident that when Mulayam Singh Yadav, for example, attacked English language education and made Hindi compulsory and so on, he was made sure that he would send his son off to an international school in Kodaikanal, because he knew that if he wants his son to do well, the boy had to have English. And that was essentially the realization that many, many Indian parents today have. So I don't think one can credit the Brits other than for the fact that because it was their language, this happened to be the language we all got saddled with.
Okay. So I take over from Rotarian Jagannathan here and Rotarian Shamathan from the Rotary Club of Madras. I do have a couple of questions that have come from the audience. Incidentally, I'm a member of the Thiruvananthapuram constituency too, so it gives me great pleasure. Yes, absolutely.
Is your vote still there?
It is.
That's what is important.
Yes. So a lot of the questions asked from the audience have already been covered by you, but there are still a few more on the lighter side that I'd like to take up today. Let me start with something that's been at the back of my mind for a very long time. After a successful 3-year decade stint at the United Nations, what all did you have to actually unlearn and relearn to handle the troglodytes and snollygosters of Indian politics?
Relearn is actually not the right word. I had to learn almost from scratch a totally new way of functioning. I mean, the world of the United Nations is exciting, challenging, problematic. Diplomacy is never simple. There are often issues of trust and betrayal in that world as well. But politics is a whole different order of magnitude. I mean, here, what one finds is that this is in many ways a profession that is carried out by people who have done nothing else for the most part, who come into it from their student days, work in it. It's what the French would call a chasse gardée, a closed hunting ground for those who are in it. And when you come from the outside, there is an inevitable amount of resentment, though it's perhaps that much greater because for them they feel the stakes are that much greater. So I didn't exactly get a pleasant reception into the world of politics, despite winning my first election by a lack of votes, which was a record in the constituency. Thank you, but there were a lot of people who I think felt that it made it all the more important to cut me down to size. So within a few months, I was in the middle of all sorts of unwanted controversies that wouldn't have been controversies anywhere else. I had more lies told about me in the public media than I dare say any politician has had to endure for a long time. My back was perforated with stiletto sort of gashes, which some of which may have come from my own side. I don't want to blame anyone. There was an awful lot of stuff that was completely eye-opening and educative. I kind of told myself that, you know, it's like a freshman in college in India has to go through ragging. This is my ragging, you know, I better just take it. And you know, it was a tough time. There was a big setback or two early on, including a resignation from the ministry, which I was very, very sad to do because it was a ministry that I was enjoying and actually making a difference in. A lot of things, but I was able through persistence and hard work to be able to re-establish my credentials and come back into the government and subsequently make my own contribution to national discourse in other ways outside politics as well. I've tried, as you very graciously said, Dr. Geeta said, not to be confined by politics. I have used it as a platform, as a springboard rather than a straitjacket. I don't want it to confine me. I want it to be something I can use to expand what is possible in our public domain, including by trying to advocate for certain values and principles that I hold dear and which are in the Constitution but which are not always observed. Particularly, a lot of my private members' bills have been about expanding notions of freedom that are enshrined in the Constitution but not reflected in some of the laws that I'm seeking to amend, whether it's the sedition law, whether it's the law that criminalizes sexual behavior amongst individuals without coercion and without, with mutual consent, and yet it's criminalized in our country, very unusual in a democracy. All of these things I have been trying to speak out against and trying to move. Equally, anti-discrimination has been a concern of mine. And then I've also used the attention that the country is paying me to advance larger issues and causes, some of which may not actually feature in the political space, but which may at least contribute to some broader sense of what it is that our country should be all about. So my latest book is called Why I Am a Hindu, and what it's trying to do is move away from the sterile arguments we are seeing about, if you like, good Hindus versus godless secularists, into a serious argument about what is a good Hindu. What do we believe? What does the faith teach us? That, in my view, is being distorted and betrayed by the so-called Hindutva brigade that is in many ways presuming to speak for a faith that they are actually violating in their own conduct. So these are the kinds of issues I've tried to take up. In turn, I've been privileged, as Mohan is here, to, let me stress, the creation of the All India Professionals Congress was indeed my proposal to the party. And it's got off to a wonderful start. We're already present in 20 states. We have 45 chapters. And some tremendously interesting work is coming out of it. I actually did say, when I first talked about this, I said I wanted to be a kind of Rotary club within the Congress party. And the idea would be that the engine of the organization would lie in its individual chapters. Just as you have your governors and so on, we have a state leadership as well. But each individual chapter is free to take its own initiatives, discuss what they want to discuss, call or not call a mainstream political leader, call or not call somebody outside politics to address them. And we found some very interesting varieties in the kinds of things people are doing. So today we've just launched this report on Tirupur, showing that Make in India is neither generating jobs nor generating manufacturing. It's killing small and medium enterprises and costing jobs. In Delhi, the All India Professionals Congress chapter has done a very interesting white paper on air pollution, which is a big crisis in Delhi going on. The Gurgaon chapter led a candlelight march of 100 people to protest the assault on the school bus by the Padmavat protesters. We had the Kerala chapter, after Cyclone Oki, got a presentation from an expert on satellite imagery and studying weather, but how to study cyclones and what went wrong and what should be right in future. They also had a separate issue where they got the writer and television personality Rajdeep Sardesai to address them on current affairs. So all sorts of different things are happening. one chapter will be studying GST implementation, another chapter will be studying some of the challenges facing the IT industry today as layoffs are mounting. And I feel pleased that the professionals, which is after all the background I come from, now have a direct and relevant way of being connected to politics. Otherwise, you all would go to work hard, pay your taxes, and come home and complain about the politicians. Now, you don't have to do that. You can actually tell them directly what you think. You can give them ideas they'll have to listen to. Your thoughts may find themselves in the manifestos of political parties, or at least of my party. Your ideas may come into the public domain, as the professionals report on Tirupur will do in tomorrow's newspapers. You should be able to see this. There is, in other words, now a mechanism available to the professional, the person like me, to connect into politics at whatever level of engagement they're prepared to. Many of you are very busy with your work. You don't have any time for full-time politics, and you're certainly not interested in doing dharnas or hartals. But you want to give your ideas, you want to give your professional skills, you want to be taken seriously. Here we are, the All India Professionals Congress is there.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I have one more question closely related to the one I asked from past President Srikanth of the Rotary Club of Madras. He says, if you were to give a prize for talking more and acting less, would you give it to the United Nations or to India?
Let me say that sometimes talk is rather valuable. As Churchill, whom I don't usually like to quote because I'm not a fan of his, rather memorably put it once, jaw is better than war. And that's why the talking at the United Nations serves a purpose. It also, in many of these UN conferences, they kind of set the state of the world's agenda on some major issues. We're also conscious of the environment, but was anybody paying attention to the environment before the first UN conference on the world environment in Stockholm in 1971? I don't think so. And then every 10 years thereafter, they had repeat conferences in Rio, in Kyoto, and so on. And the result has been that now nobody can pretend to be unaware of the issues facing the environment. Yes, it involves a lot of speeches and a lot of talking, but it results in action. And the great advantage the UN has is that this talking leads to action where it's needed, namely on the part of the member states and the part of the countries. So the UN won't come here and act necessarily, though some agencies do in developing countries, UNICEF, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UN Development Program. These are all very active bodies, or the World Health Organization, the International Labour Organization. But their means of arriving at the policies and conclusions and so on is through talking. So I wouldn't say it's talking more and acting less. In India, I would say there is a bit more of a challenge because we have two problems about that. One is that we talk a lot without necessarily expecting anything to result from it. It has become our nature that talking has become an end. I didn't like that. Talking has become an end in itself. And as a result, the divorce between the diagnosis of a problem and implementing a solution to it is unfortunately a rather grave problem. The second problem with talking and action is that sometimes talking becomes a substitute for action. So that if a politician, for example, says that he believes in something and something should be done, some politicians seem to believe that absolves them of the responsibility to actually do it. And in some cases, our bureaucracy is a past master at not doing it. I have had the experience, and I have not had that much experience in government, two rather short stints in two ministries. But the marvelous thing is, bureaucrats, you say we should do this, the bureaucrat says, sir, but this, but that, there is a problem, precedent, this, that. You say, look, I'm telling you, do it. I understand, I've heard you, I understood the objections. I don't think there should be enough to stop us, do it. They will never say no. Bureaucrats are very good at saying, yes, sir. 3 months later, you ask, was that done? Sir, we can't find the file. So this is also very much embedded in our culture. And our bureaucracy is far more process-oriented than outcome-oriented. So you can tell your friend that we should give the award to him.
You should allow me one question, please.
Sure, yeah.
It's so tempting to speak to him, that's the reason. Talking about talking. The nation wants to know about,
I don't like that phrase.
about your obsession, if I may call it that, for big words. I read the other day
How
about...
many big words have I used this evening?
No, not at all, not at all, not at all.
I rest my case. This is a complete exaggeration.
I would say you brought yourself down to our level, and perhaps that's why you didn't use it.
This is the way I normally talk.
Okay. I read the other day about an English test where one was marked on a 1 to Shashi tharoor scale. For example, you talk about the oeuvre. I don't know whether I pronounced it right. Oeuvre. Okay, that's
all oeuvre means is work.
Oh,
or the body of work.
Okay, of a P.G. Wodehouse book, a word, forget Bertie Wooster. I doubt even whether Jeeves would have been aware of it. And that to a Wodehouse fan, I'm also his fan, I thought goes against the grain of the author, who, as he himself says, goes in for light writing and therefore is looked down upon by the intelligentsia and sneered at by them. Could you comment on that?
No, I mean, Wodehouse certainly, to my mind, offers an indefinite store of pleasure. But you do need a certain vocabulary to appreciate him. Because when he says things like, you know, if he wasn't actually disgruntled, he certainly wasn't gruntled. Yeah. You need to know that gruntled is not really a word, it's a clever innovation by Wodehouse. You need to know what disgruntled means, etc. He has such a rich storehouse of classical allusions, so when he says he groaned slightly and winced, like Prometheus when his vulture dropped in for lunch, then you need to know that Prometheus was a classical character who was tied up and the vultures fed on him, came and ate him. So you can imagine groaned slightly and winced as if you're being eaten by a vulture, but if you don't know enough of the classical allusion, you won't appreciate that humor of Wodehouse's. So to say that Wodehouse is just light and people can't appreciate him, I think undoes in many ways the great contributions he's made, including his ability to subvert the canons of the English language. The way in which humor is used literally subversively. One of my favorite Wodehouse lines is, unlike the male codfish, which upon discovering that it has become the father of 3,400,000 little codfish, cheerfully resolves to love them all, the English aristocracy is apt to look with a somewhat jaundiced eye upon its younger sons. Now, there is, you know, a complete collection of a sentence, and of course we know that they sent their younger sons to rule us, so that's exactly what they sent them off to India. So the fact is that these things suggest that the light humor requires a certain appreciation for what he's doing with the language.
Certainly.
The next one's a googly, but being a cricketer, I think you should take it with ease. It's from N. Mathur of Rotary Club, Annanagar. Very similar to the kind of question that Rotary and Jagannathan asked. Where can one find the high-flying rhetoric words that you use apart from a dictionary? I think a lot of people want to use similar words in speeches, etc. Any ready reckoners that you could suggest?
No, but the honest truth is I've never mugged up a dictionary in my life. I just read widely, indiscriminately, copiously. I was a child in an India without television, without computers, without mobile phones, without Nintendo, and I was an asthmatic child who couldn't go out and play as much as he wanted to, with the result that books were my only refuge. And because I read so widely, I encountered a lot of words, and frankly, you don't really need a dictionary, because if you see the same word used in 3 different places, you pretty much get a sense of what the word means and how it's used. As long as you're reading sort of respectable books, you'll improve your vocabulary without even trying. So that's really what I did. I mean, I wasn't even conscious that my vocabulary was a talking point until it became, as Mr. Jagannathan was pointing out, it became such an issue here. Until then I was just, okay, there's some words which I may have perhaps later on, once I became aware of this, deliberately used for effect, partly in order to stir up some. But for the most part, in the normal conversation, and there's a heck of a lot of evidence in my favor. I published 17 books over the last 30 odd years. I have lots and lots of speeches and interviews on YouTube. So it's not difficult to see how I really speak and how I really write. And I think to to judge me purely by a few difficult words.
Yeah. Well, she gets. You're ready, or
Let me give Mohan something to think about. You know.
Asking me a question?
Yes.
Asking me a question.
I'm asking you a question. So, the talk that's very prevalent, not just in the country, but also among corporates and even in the education system, is Digital India. So, is Digital India an illusion given high illiteracy, poor infrastructure, spread of rural India, other economic priorities of survival? What are your thoughts? This is a question from Bashwa Mukherjee.
Sorry, I couldn't understand the entire question. You'd have to repeat
Okay.
again.
Is Digital India an illusion?
An illusion. Okay.
Yeah, given all these factors, the illiteracy, the infrastructure, the large rural spread.
So I think the answer would be in two parts. One would be what you're talking about when you say Digital India. I think there have been many strides on getting government services closer to the citizen using technology. And I think because of the success we've had with the spread of cellular networks, even though you've not been able to get fixed line internet access to many places, and I think that's an ongoing initiative with the network backbone that's being built out throughout the country, you're still able to get some form of access to the internet, and therefore you're able to deliver services such as birth certificates. And now, for example, even when you register land, I recently went to register a lease agreement in Chennai, and almost all of it happened online and it was all uploaded. And you know, you're able to check on and double check things that you couldn't do in the past because it's all up in the cloud right now. So some of those things have really helped out. Now you talked about things such as illiteracy. I think we're about 74-75% literate. I think there is still a sense of illiteracy in terms of a lot of the information is not localized. But I think that also is we made large strides in that direction in the last couple of years, or I'd say the last 4 or 5 years. Where now I think, if I'm not wrong, I recently read somewhere that an overwhelming amount of content that's being accessed is now in localized language versus the English language if you look at being accessed out of the country. So yes, there are still problems, and I mean there are going to be infrastructure problems given the size of our country and how much work that needs to be done in that direction. But I don't think it's an illusion by any means. I think it's an ongoing process.
Thank you. Shashi, not letting you go. Here's one more. Isn't Make in India to be preceded by Teach India to Make in India?
Well said.
Isn't that one of the factors because of which the world is not beating a path to our doors in spite of our demographic dividend?
No, the world is not beating a path at all. In fact, I remember the first big announcement for Make in India that Mr. Modi presided over was an announcement by Foxconn, the Taiwanese chip and hardware maker, to invest $3 billion in India. Have we seen one penny of that $3 billion so far? Has anyone seen a hole being driven into the ground to put a foundation for a $3 billion Foxconn factory? I haven't, and the guess that I would have is that we're not going to see it, because perhaps with the dramatic changes in the IT world, it will not be necessary for a company like Foxconn to come and make its hardware here. I do worry about this. I've read a study that says that in the IT sector, which has otherwise been a triumph for us, something like 67,000 jobs will be lost in the next 3 years. And we're already seeing IT companies laying off Indians. And that's why I'm welcoming the fact that people in Bangalore's Professionals Congress are actually looking into this question. What do we do? What does India do? Partly we need to do some serious retraining, because the kinds of skills that are required in a world of AI, artificial intelligence, are very different from the kind of skills required when you are trying to prevent Y2K crashes and when you were trying to write software programs. Nowadays, by the way, there's AI systems that are writing software programs that in the past you had to hire an Indian IT guy to do. So people have to wake up and realize that unless we absolutely keep up with what the rest of the world is doing, we are all in very serious trouble.
So there's someone who's been prodding me for a question for a long time. Mr. Vaidyanathan of the AIPC Spinal Foundation. How do we harness the demographic divide among the disabled? And we and IIT Madras have some kind of a collaboration for frugal innovation for wheelchairs, etc. So how do you see this kind of?
It's a very interesting question to which I will not claim any expertise, sir. Are you the one who's asked the question? Please tell us. There is a wheelchair that's a frugal innovation product. Great.
Great.
No, in fact, I have personally, sort of in terms of my own charitable work, I've given some wheelchairs to disabled people and various other means of locomotion, because the biggest challenge for them is just basically getting around. But there are also other kinds of ways in which, I mean, one should not only think of physical disability. For example, many of us have been advocating hiring of blind people in jobs where sight is not so important, business process offshoring jobs, where call centers and customer services, which they can do without necessarily having to see something. They can speak to customers and cooperate. We should certainly look at situations in which other kinds of disabilities are compensated for. I'm not an expert on this. I need to know more. I have personally been an advocate of seeing more of this done, but when you say skill development, it will vary enormously according to the disability that the individual is suffering and the opportunity that the individual is being trained for. So certainly the locomotion aspect is very important. It's getting people to move makes it easier for them. But at the same time, unless we can also encourage in the public policy sphere laws that make it mandatory for government departments and even private companies to hire at least 1%, 2%, 3% of their recruits from the disabled community, it's going to be a very, very uphill challenge, because anybody who is not obliged by law to take a disabled person will always be inclined to say, will it be easier and simpler and cheaper for me to take somebody who is not suffering a disability. We've seen this in an earlier era. The women here know that very often a qualified woman lost out on a job to a man because the employer would think, well, this woman might go away and get pregnant and I'll lose several months of her productivity and I'll still have to pay her. If I hire a man, I won't have to do. There was a de facto discrimination in recruitment policies against women because they would be, for a period of time, less productive. And the same sort of logic will be held against applicants in the disabled community unless, I think, there were incentives or policies. I would be very happy to give tax breaks to companies that hire disabled people. I would be very happy to require government departments to hire a certain percentage. These are things we can do as public policy, and then we can talk about how we can skill them better. Okay, we are unfortunately late for my next event.
Just
I've got wall-to-wall events today, and I really apologize.
So just a few quick questions, which either Mr. Mohan or you could field. Should I be proud when somebody calls me a Macaulay Putra?
I think it's meant to be an insult.
It's an
but since I don't like Macaulay, for me it's a really big insult to be called a Macaulay Putra, merely because I speak English. Macaulay is somebody who actually said that all the learning of India and Arabia is not worth a single shelf of English books. That was the kind of arrogance and sneering contempt of the man. He's also the author of the awful Indian Penal Code, which we're stuck with even today. There's not much nice things that one can say about Lord Macaulay. The British, of course, hail him as a great liberal thinker and reformer of the 19th century. But when people say Macaulay Putra today, all they mean is a sort of Anglophile equivalent of Babar Ki Aulad. It's meant to be an insult. It's not meant to be a pleasant term. So yes, you can feel offended.
Okay. Would you think studying history is an absolute waste of time now in schools?
Absolutely not. In fact, I often said to young people when I published An Era of Darkness, I said, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going? I mean, we as individuals are curious about our parents and grandparents, their family backgrounds, the lives they led, the conditions in which they grew up, and so on. That's normal curiosity. Why should we not, as a society, be curious about what happened to our society for the last couple of 100 years? It seems to me an entirely normal thing to want to do. So I would urge people to study history, particularly in today's era. Our present government has made history ground zero, a contested battleground, where they are actually using history as a weapon to assault their pet enemies with. So if you're not comfortable in your own history, you might be misled by fantasy history. So no, we need history.
Okay, I'm getting enough signals from there. So one last question. Priya Warrior being sued for winking. What's your comment?
Actually, the whole thing is ridiculous. First of all, I mean, I love the girl's wink. I think she's terrific. I only wish I'd known girls like that when they were that age. But the truth is that she's not being sued for winking. She's been sued because the lyrics of the song, which is what we call a Mapala Pata, a song sung by the Malabar Muslims for the last 40 years. The Mapala Pata happens to be, in this case, a great favorite at Muslim weddings in the Mapala community. It sings of the love between the Prophet and his first wife Khadija. Now the irony is, the Muslims who have sued are not from the Mapala community, they're Hyderabadi Muslims who have taken the very idea that you can sing about the Prophet's love for his wife as blasphemous and so on and so forth. So they actually sued the filmmakers for the song, and the poor girl got sued because the song was picturized over her wink. It wasn't the wink for which she was sued. But though the filmmaker, the director himself is a Muslim, had hastily surrendered and said he would remove the film, there was such an outcry that he has been emboldened now to resist it. As you know, they've gone to the Supreme Court and got a stay. We'll see what the courts come up with. But we have created a country now in which being offended seems to be the route of choice. You're offended by a TV channel, for God's sake, change the channel. But no, they want the government to remove the channel. You're offended by a book, don't read the book. No, you must actually ban the book or they'll burn down the bookstore. You're offended by a movie, don't watch the movie. No, the movie cannot be screened because it offends your sensibility that somebody else is seeing the movie. This kind of nonsense, this kind of rampant intolerance absolutely must be stopped. And the only way it can be stopped is we as a society have the courage to say, if you're offended, too bad. The rest of us will see and judge for ourselves whether we should be offended. Being offended is a subjective emotion. You cannot impose it objectively on your entire country. But yet this is what is happening day after day after day. And I have to say my own tribe, the politicians, are also complicit because they find it more expedient to cave in rather than to take a tough stand and say we will uphold law and order, whatever happens. So the answer to this question at the end of the day is let's all wink in favor of freedom of expression, especially of that kind of expression.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. I mean, for a wonderful conversation and discussion that we had, and going by the large number of questions that are still there.
Stay and answer them. If you're willing to say he's a very smart young man, he'll tell you all the answers.
I think it just means that another trip is warranted.
All right, there we are. Yeah. Thank you so much.
We've touched upon various topics and we will all agree that we have had an awesome hour in conversation with Dr. Shashi
of the organizing clubs to come to the dais for a group photo. Rotarian Naresh Advani, Secretary RC Gindi, Rotarian Nikhil, Secretary RC Madras, Rotarian Vrinda, Secretary RC Ananagar Madras, Rotarian PD Sriram, Secretary RC Madras Downtown, Rotarian Balakrishnan, Secretary RC Madras Industrial City.
Sir, one please. Excuse me.
I request Rotarian Mohan, President Rotary Club of Madras, to kindly propose the vote of thanks.
Respected Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Mr. Kumar Amangalam, my fellow presidents, Rotarians, spouses, members of the Association of Congress Professionals, we are indeed honored by your presence and thank you for sparing some time for us in your busy schedule. We Rotarians have been eager to listen to you for some time and are extremely happy that it happened today.
No selfie, no face.
I have heard many of your speeches. One in particular was your speech in the British Parliament. At last I am proud that an Indian can actually teach the British the Queen's English. You very aptly in one of your other speeches mentioned the 560 million of our population are below the age of 25.
Club presence, please.
And they can be only useful if they get education and skill development. We in Rotary are in a way contributing to this. But I hope someday this will happen in a larger scale. And I hope that your tribe grows in the country, and we wish you all the best in your political career. Thanks to all the participating clubs for supporting this. Our gratitude also goes to Mr. Anand and Mr. Anish of the Association of Congress Professionals for their support. To the press, a big thank you. And to Western Hotel, the General Manager Lakshman, who is our Rotarian, for making such a wonderful arrangement. I thank you once again for being here. Thank you.